Great. So the first thing it talks about is, as per this report, 8 lakh square kilometers of India is under forest. 8 lakh. Now that's a big number because India's the geographical area is 32 lakh square kilometers. 32 lakhs. So 8 out of 8 by 32 is 25% of the geographical area of the country is under forest. That's the first thing. Is it an improvement over the previous forest report? The answer seems to be yes. How much is the improvement? 5,000 square kilometers. So always remember big numbers. Don't try to go into details. You'll not be able to remember. High level, 25%. So what are the things that I need to, when I look at this slide, let's say 2 months before prelims, what are the things I need to know? 25% of the geographical area is there. Approximately 5,000. Yeah, 5,000 is there. And here comes an important concept. I think I should take some time to explain this concept. When we talk of 25%, yeah, 25% is the forest cover. It is not forest. If you have observed it carefully, it is made up of two terms: forest and tree cover. Forest and tree cover. I've not actually mentioned here, so if you can please take it down. Forest means, the definition of forest is an area more than 1 hectare. Yeah, forest means, what is the definition of forest? Forest means an area greater than 1 hectare which has a canopy density of 10% or more. This is the definition. So forest, as per the definition by the FSI, as it's called, the Forest Survey Institute, FSI, it defines forest as an area more than 1 hectare, which a canopy density of more than or 10% or more. Okay, so you may say, oh, okay, so this is I wouldn't say misleading, but this is somewhat interesting. Oh, okay, so it does not mean that 25% of India's area has green cover. No, it does not mean that. It means 25% of India's area has land of 1 hectare or more, which has density of more than 10%. Are you able to see the subtle difference over here? Yeah. So when it is, suppose if there is a land of 2 hectares, okay. Now 10% of 2 hectares is 0.2 hectare. Let's say it has 0.3 hectares of continuous tree cover. Then this whole 2 hectare becomes a forest land. Okay, I hope you understand that. Now you may say, yeah, perhaps this definition is not a very right way of capturing things. That is what it is. Yeah, I thought you should know this. That is what it is. If you have, especially those who have been preparing for, let's say, last 1 or 2 years, have you come across this 10% criteria in some other concept? So the clue is, if 10% of something is true, then the whole thing is true. It's a very vague clue, a very bad clue, I think. So the clue is, if 10% has been done, it is considered that 100% is done. That's a more clearer clue. Any idea? Excellent. Okay. Open defecation. In fact, I didn't have this in mind, but this is also true. This is also true. The open defecation, exactly. Village electrification. Village electrification. Yeah. So anything to do with electrification. So what it says is, traditionally, in a village, if 10% of households plus public places, which is the Anganwadi center, the panchayat institutes and all, if 10% of the households plus public places are electrified, the whole village is considered electrified. That's why you need to be careful. And I think one good thing that the current government has done, we need to give credit, is that we are moving from village electrification to household electrification. Are you able to understand the concept? Can someone tell me the answer in yes or no? Is 100% of India's villages electrified? That is to say, is 100% electrified? Have we achieved 100% village electrification? Absolutely. The answer is yes. The answer is yes. The reason is, if you look at a tweet by the Prime Minister as early as April 2018, he goes on record saying India is now 100% electrified. Yeah. Now the reason why I know this for sure is as part of IIT, I also work with IIT Madras with these state governments, Manipur, Meghalaya, Assam, and J&K, in the village electrification. So that village that was electrified, it was not a grid line; it was a solar off-grid solar system. Okay, so and that village was mentioned also. I'm forgetting the name. It's a village in Manipur. I'll get the name maybe if you want. Uh, you have seen village without. Okay, Harsh, it will be good if you can also tell me. It is possible. Means there may be one or two exclusions, but officially, as Prachi had said, on paper. No, that's a very bureaucratic way of saying, Prachi. I can see you are already reaching there. So on paper, we are 100% electrified. Uh, you know how they have defined, if you have a distribution transformer and lines, if the panchayat office is electrified, and if 10% of households are electrified, yeah, that I believe is true for all. In my view, it's true for all, because I have not come across villages which are where there is zero electrification, but it is possible, Harsh, maybe in some interior parts of India. Oh yes, Lisang in Manipur, thank you so much, Prachi. Lisang, yes, thank you. That's the village in Manipur. So I can see someone is googling as I talk. I appreciate that. So Lisang in Manipur was the village that we would proudly say that we are part of that 10% electrification journey. Okay. Now, where were we and why did we go? Yeah. So this is for you to tell that it is the 10% rule that the government seems to apply for a lot of things, including this. But if someone asks you how much percentage of household is electrified, the answer is approximately this. It may be a little more. You can comfortably remember this. 85% of households in India are electrified. Yeah, try to remember this, guys. But if you say, is it 8? Because 85% is an average, no? So it seems it varies from anywhere between 45 to 100%. So if you take all the villages of India, and how many villages do we have? 5.5 lakhs or something. Yeah, 5.6 lakhs, I think. Whatever is the total number of villages. If you take all the villages, the lowest what the Ministry of Power says is 45%. The highest that they're saying is 100%. 100% is possible, guys. Okay, great. And since we are at river electrification, I'll tell you one or two interesting things also, why it is becoming so difficult and contested also. So we did a project for Assam also, and I was amazed to find that there are these islands which you have heard of them. Have you heard of this? Riverine Islands? I'm sure you would have heard of Riverine Islands. So completely cut off on all sides by river, and Brahmaputra you have a lot of river islands. In fact, Manjuli Island is the largest one in the world, I think. So you have a lot of riverine islands, and we gave them the solar packs. Okay, let's say there are 100 people. Now we also have this need to do operation and maintenance. First year we did, second year we did, third year there was a flood. Okay, out of 100 people, 85 people have shifted along with the solar panels. Okay, so it is always, and they have now moved on to another village. Then they again come back. This migration is a major problem in rural electrification. So what happens in Assam from island to the mainland happens in the case of Jammu Kashmir from lowland to the highland. So during peak winter, the villagers, they take all their belongings and they come to the valley. During the normal, that is during the summer, they go back to the villages. But in between, what happens? The solar system stops working because you have unplugged it in your own way. You have used cutters and all that. It does not work. Then it comes as a complaint to us, and the client shouts and all that happens. But this is the challenge. I had this opportunity to actually witness this at a very ground level as to what really happens in a electrification project. Anyway, so this 10% rule is important, guys. I would want you to remember this. Let's come back to the definition. So I said definition means 10% or more. So the forest itself, okay, so the forest itself is divided into, from a canopy density point of view, it is divided into 3 types. 10 to 40% is called as an open forest. Means very less canopy density. Okay. 40 to 70 is your moderate. This one. Yeah, this is 40 to 70%. and greater than 70% is very dense forest. Is this clear? And hence the criteria of 10% and above is true. So 10 to 40 is open forest, 40 to 70 is the moderate density forest, and greater than 70 is the very dense forest. Till date, there has been a difficulty in convincing even the Ministry of Power to say, why do you go with 10%? No, remove it. There is even a Hindu news article, if you just Google, no, how was village electrification calculated? One of the articles that you'll get is a Hindu newspaper article of 2018, where they explain this concept reasonably well. Okay, guys. So this is on the coverage of forest. Now, top 3 states showing increase in the forest cover. So the key point here is increase. Huh? So be careful. Increase means what? So increase in the numerator divided by denominator. As in, earlier it was something. Now it has increased with respect to the earlier one. Okay. So it is not absolute. It is increased with respect to the previous. What do I say? Previous report. So in this, if you look at it, Karnataka, it has shown an increase of 1,000 square kilometers. Andhra Pradesh 990 and Kerala 823. These are the top 3 states that show an increase in forest cover. Now, the interesting part is if you look at it and if you logically think it, how is it possible, yeah, that in 2 years suddenly 1,000 square kilometers of forest drop off? Yeah, one reason is that in the earlier survey, maybe they did not do the survey properly. Okay, the other more cynical explanation is they do not do the survey this time properly. So one of the things, there is a challenge, but officially we are stating that the forest cover has increased in these 3 states, with Karnataka leading it. Sometimes data like this becomes important, guys. Otherwise, I would not spend a lot of time going through line by line. This you must remember specifically area-wise. Madhya Pradesh has the largest forest cover in the country, area-wise. It's not very difficult to imagine. No? We have a lot of tiger reserves, national parks, and therefore biosphere reserves. So you can somewhat gauge, yeah, Madhya Pradesh is possible. Followed by Arunachal Pradesh. That's also somewhat feasible because if you look at it, Arunachal Pradesh would come under the eastern part of the Himalayas, which is also a biodiversity hotspot. If you remember, out of the 4 biodiversity hotspots, one was the Indo-Burma region. So pretty much Arunachal Pradesh and some of the northeastern states would come under that. Chhattisgarh, quite possible. If anyone has been in Chhattisgarh or even otherwise, you know that Chhattisgarh has a good forest cover. Odisha and Maharashtra. Now, the reason why I put this and I want you to remember is generally there is an option. Area-wise, which is, first of all, we may not read the question properly. Oh, largest forest cover, okay, Chhattisgarh. Or you may put Arunachal Pradesh. No, largest is Madhya Pradesh, followed by Arunachal, Chhattisgarh. They may give an option, let's say, just to confuse, they may give an option like Uttarakhand, for example. Whenever you think of Uttarakhand, yeah, Jim Corbett National Park, there seems to be true. That is not true because they are looking at the largest area. Yeah. So the larger the state, there is a greater chance that that state may have one of the largest forest area because it's very unlikely someone would think that Maharashtra or for that matter Odisha would be states 4 and 5. It's very rare. Left to myself, I generally would not think that Odisha and Maharashtra would come. But then that's because of the impression that we have. Why not Odisha? The coastal Odisha is fine, but if you look at some of the northern part of Odisha, it is heavily forested. Yeah. Similarly with Maharashtra, if you look at Maharashtra, yeah, Western Ghats. So some part is forest, and that could be the dense forest. If you look at some of the parts of the Vidarbha region, there also you have forest. For example, the Tadoba Tiger Reserve. Obviously, there seems to be some forest because of which a tiger exists there. So this is the way you need to kind of connect and try to remember it better and push the content into your long-term memory so that you can recall it even after several months. Okay. Percentage-wise forest cover. Percentage-wise forest cover. Top 5 states. Percentage. So percentage means what? Forest cover divided by area of the state. Correct? That is the forest cover, no? I mean into 100. Yeah, so whatever is the percent. So Mizoram is the state which has the highest forest cover in terms of percentages. The percentage was also given, but it was tending to be a little complicated. So if you can remember it as Mizoram, Arunachal Pradesh, Meghalaya, Manipur, and Nagaland. Not really very difficult. but at least the top 2, 3, if you can remember, it is good. Mizoram. Okay. So in fact, I figured out how to remember Mizoram, and maybe I'll ask you this question. Uh, uh, can anyone relate Mizoram to let me be more specific. Can anyone relate Mizoram to any of the Indian Army's institutions in Mizoram? So the clue is linking Mizoram to Indian Army's institution. Not really. It's not the Gorkha arrangement if you are talking about. Okay, I'll give you an example. In the army, there are 2 schools that are extremely popular. Okay, and if you get a chance and if you love Discovery Channel like me, you can see this. There is this school called High Altitude Warfare School. Okay, High Altitude Warfare School. My God, I forgot in which state. I'm sorry, High Altitude Warfare School. Not sure between Uttarakhand, Himachal, or J&K where it is. Doesn't matter. That is on the Himalayas. Then there is a school called as the Jungle Warfare School. Jungle Warfare, Counter Insurgency and Jungle Warfare School of the Indian Army, which is at a place called, I don't know how to pronounce it. This is the place. So somewhat you can relate. Army's Jungle Warfare School is also there. They're in Mizoram. So obviously Mizoram needs to have a lot of forest area. Okay, so that's how you could remember perhaps. Meghalaya, Manipur, and Nagaland. So that is those are interestingly Nagaland, Manipur, Mizoram. All of them are, and Arunachal Pradesh. All of them are bordering on the Myanmar. So that's an easy way to remember. Arunachal Pradesh, Nagaland, Manipur, Mizoram. Those are 4 states that come in the Indo-Burma region, which is anyway a biodiversity hotspot. And Meghalaya. Meghalaya is enormous amount of rainfall, so you can say that there must be a good forest cover. Okay, great. So that's about the forest report. We have more points, I guess. Doesn't end here. Yeah. So this time, what they have done, there are 2, 3 things that I saw in this time. They have done a little new. The mangrove cover they have separately reported. So what they have done, earlier they used to put everything under the category of forest, but this time they have reported the mangrove cover separately. That also shows a very slight increase of 54 square kilometers in these states, Gujarat, Maharashtra, Odisha, it is shown. What 2 new things what they have done? They have for the first time calculated 2 more, or they have included 2 more definitions. The first one is growing stock. So growing stock means they are referring to the volume of tree above a particular diameter. Okay, I think it is put as 2 feet or something, but that feet may not be that important. But what is important is they have brought for the first time the volume of all trees. So it's more of an estimate. You will how will you kind of go about assessing this? How do you go about assessing this? You will first start with the tree density. Yeah. Then you will find the approximate tree width. You will take one average tree width and then multiply by the number of trees. So that is how the estimation is done. Similarly, they have done for carbon stock. So carbon stock they are saying is 7,000 million tons, which means this is to say that the Indian forests collectively have 7,000 million tons of carbon. The naturally sequestered carbon, so to say. Yeah, we have 7,000 million tons of carbon. So all of them it has increased. So this has increased by 100 million. This has increased by 40 million. So generally, I have seen the Indian State of Forest report. It paints a rosy picture, or should I say, a greeny picture? Yeah, and generally it says that we have been improving every 2 years. Okay, yeah, bamboos and wetlands have been separately measured. So a lot of classification has happened this time, so that you can focus on one particular area and see how that particular area has improved over a period of time. So how has all this been done? Yeah, so this is important. How has all this been done? For the forest cover, because the land is 1 hectare and above, you could use the satellite data because it's a reasonably large area. You could do use satellite for enumeration of the forest resource. And the satellite that is dedicatedly used for this is Resource Sat 2. You're able to see this? Resource Sat 2, which is one of the Indian remote sensing satellites. Specifically, the name itself is Resource Sat. and they were able to measure. But for the tree, so what did we say? Forest plus trees. Forest was the definition of 1 hectare, greater than 1 hectare, having greater than or equal to 10% canopy density. The trees, they are sometimes also called as TOF. TOF stands for tree outside forest. Tree outside forest. And in a land which is less than 1 hectare. A land which is less than 1 hectare. So tree enumeration from satellite is relatively not so accurate because the area becomes much smaller. So it is a combination of satellite data and ground level measurement. Okay, so this is one thing I wanted to just kind of communicate to you. And it is in tune with the India's vision of digital India. I think that's what their website is saying. It includes all land, paper. It includes all land. All lands under the territory of India. Private plantations, if someone has a rubber plantation, it gets included in the forest. Okay. So that completes our Indian Forest Act, the Indian State of Forest Report 2019. I would urge you to look forward to the Indian State of Forest Report. All that I want you to do is, anyway, you'll get it from newspaper or from several other sources. Try to just replace this. And if you think you have to add more points, you add it. But in my view, 2 slides is quite sufficient for this one single topic. Yeah, Indian State of Forest. Okay. Biodiversity Act 2002. So, even before we go into this, go into the details of the provisions of the Act, let us first look at some cases. Okay. So, what happened in year 1996? 1996, an American company applied for a patent. Okay. You know what that patent was for? What were they trying to get patent for? Very close, Prachi. They also did for turmeric, but the case that I'm saying in 1996 was for this, neem. Okay. Yeah, exactly, neem. So neem May, what they did was, so they said that, look, our scientists have worked long and hard, and we have figured out that if you apply certain formulations of neem on the plants, it prevents fungal infection. And the European patent, they applied in Europe, by the way, and the European Patent Agency also granted it in 1996. And in 2000, the people in India got to know about it. The environmentalists and the people of India got to know about it. They fought tooth and nail. Why would they not fight? Because if a patent is given, what does it mean? If you use the same product neem to cure your plants of fungal infection, then you have to pay royalties to that company. Okay. So Indians, it was led by a very efficient environmentalist by the name Mandana Shiva. So she had represented Indian people, and she, along with other NGOs, they're able to provide proof. Proof of what? Proof of the fact that neem was indeed used in India for generations. That's where the problem comes. Generally, you can't give proof for the fact that we've been using neem. I mean, it is so obvious that you don't feel like documenting it. Yeah. But then, as it always happens in the court or in many of the international forum, in contracts, for example, I deal with contracts. At the end of the day, they only say, okay, where is it written? Do you have an email communication? Do you have a written communication? What is written in the contract? They will forget all the communication that has happened. They don't have time also. When you are there at a contract dispute resolution, it's all sabut. Yeah, only the evidence will work. So in this case, India fought hard to get the evidence, and eventually the patent was revoked. So this is 1996. Okay. Now that was neem. Then later, after a few more years, as Prachi said, there was an issue with turmeric also. So turmeric, two scientists, so-called scientists, They said that they worked long and hard, and they eventually found that turmeric has very great antibiotic properties, antiseptic properties. So once again, the same issue. We've been applying turmeric as a remedy for centuries together. How can if you get a patent? Does it mean that every time you use turmeric, you have to ask your permission? So obviously, that turmeric was the second case. The third case, even more interesting, was for an eatable item. Yeah, if anyone knows what I'm referring to, you can figure it out. It came in. It was very popular at that point in time. But yeah, exactly. It was for basmati rice. So basmati rice, what they did was the US researchers once again worked long and hard, and they created a rice which is basmati, right? Long rice, fine, has a nice fragrance. And instead of basmati, they called it these two names: Kalmati and Texmati. Okay, Texmati. And the reason was Kalmati was discovered in California Institute of Technology, which is a very renowned one, and Texmati was in University of Texas, Austin. So once again, the same Allah was created. So so this was in 2001. So it was beginning to become clear to the people and the Indian government that it is extremely important to protect our biodiversity and, more importantly, the genetic diversity of India should not go out of India and be patented by someone else. It can still go with our permission, but it should not go out and he becomes the owner. You cannot afford such a patent. Okay, so that's the background of the Biodiversity Act of 2002. And yeah, even otherwise, India was a party to the Convention on Biodiversity. Okay, remember this Convention on Biodiversity, 1992, along with Rio Earth Summit. And therefore, at some point in time, India had to enact similar laws to protect its biodiversity. So all these cases, it gave India the necessary push to enact the Biodiversity Act. Okay, so two, three provisions of the Act, and then we'll go into. It's very light actually. This Act does not have too many provisions, luckily. So first is the definition. So how does it define? How does it define biodiversity as? It defines biodiversity as variability among living organisms from all sources and ecological complexes. Okay, so which means what? Variability among living organisms. So variability among living organisms is further detailed out by saying diversity within species or between species. So now diversity within species is what kind of diversity in the three things that we have seen? It is the genetic diversity. That is the diversity within species. Diversity between species is the species diversity, and ecosystem is the ecosystem diversity. So in a way, it nicely connects what we studied several classes before. Three types: genetic, species, and ecosystem diversity. And genetic and species is part of this living organism diversity. Ecosystem diversity is part of ecological complexes diversity. Okay, so far so good. So that's on the biodiversity. So that is the definition of biodiversity. The second thing is the definition of biological resources. How does it define biological resources? So it defines them as plant, animal, microorganism, or their part, genetic material, byproducts, etc., etc. But does not include human genetic material. This is the only thing I want you to remember. First, the definition of biodiversity, which roughly corresponds to what we have already discussed, and then what is included under biological resources. So it's broadly flora and fauna. So fauna also includes microorganisms. Okay. Now, what was the objective? So the objective, if you read it, it will make it very clear about why it came into picture. First objective: to protect India's rich biodiversity. Okay, first is to protect this guy, the biodiversity itself, and not just that. Associated knowledge against their use by foreign individuals and organizations without sharing the benefits arising out of such use. It makes it abundantly clear why the wording is the way it is. Yeah, not just do we protect the biodiversity, which is our responsibility because India is a signatory to the Convention on Biological Diversity, but also the associated knowledge against their use by foreign individuals and organizations without sharing the benefits arising out of such use. The second part is to check biopiracy. Kind of self-explanatory. Biopiracy. What is biopiracy? We'll look into it. Can someone help me in case, because you guys could be reading across subjects? There was this elderly lady who's called as the Encyclopedia of the Forest. She got Padma Shri. Do you know Padma Shri? There was this one old village lady from Karnataka. Just I'm connecting the dots. If someone can Google and tell me also, that's fine. So that as a collectively as a class we can do it. Is it so? I think it's a Kannadiga name, Subhashish. Tulsi Munda sounds of a Jharkhand or some exactly Kannadiga name. I don't know what Gowda it was. Just try to remember it because I found that was very unique. For the first time they gave Tulsi Gowda, is it? Probably. I'm not sure, but if that is the Tulsi Gowda, okay. Oh, so you just got the surname wrong, Subhashish. Okay. So Tulsi Gowda. And this time there was also a transgender woman who got the Padma Shri. So I think there was something unique about the Padma Shri this time. So this lady, elderly lady, Tulsi Gowda, she is called as the how does the media describe her? The live encyclopedia of forest or something. Okay. So she apparently has a very good idea of the traditional knowledge that rests in the forest. So she is a shiny example of the need. It's also a recognition that the government. I was quite impressed when people across have been given, because anyway Padma Shri means you'll get from people across the spectrum. For example, scientists get Padma Shri, social workers get Padma Shri, environmentalists also get Padma Shri. But generally, these are all high-profile people. This year there was one Padma Shri from IIT Madras also. I remember Professor Pradeep from Chemical Engineering Department. So generally, when I think of Padma Shri, I usually think of intellectuals, public figures, journalists, social workers, sometimes ex-politicians, so on and so forth. Okay, even ex-civil servants, they have got Padma Shri. But this time it was a little unique. H.C. Verma, who is this gentleman? I don't know. Is it the Chief Justice Verma you are saying? Oh, physics book writer, is it? Okay, I'm not aware. Thank you for the information. So that's the first part, which is protect. And second, they are very clearly saying check biopiracy. Now let's look at two things. Can I use the knowledge, traditional knowledge, and use it for profit? The answer is yes. India allows it. So when I use traditional knowledge, suppose I sit with this elderly lady, Tulsi Gowda, and I speak to her and I try to understand. Suppose, let's say she gives me 5 different formulation of fighting arthritis. Suppose, let's say, I am a chemical company. So what I do, I take the formulation that she says. She says, I take this herb, hypothetically. I mix it and I do this, I boil it, some extract comes out, I keep it for 2 days and then, do it. Then I'm a chemical company, I use it. And then what I do is, I take permission from her because it is her knowledge, number 1. Number 2, I give her a share of the profit. Number 3, I also acknowledge that this formulation has been, taken from so and so. Is that allowed? That is allowed. When a company does that, that is using the biological resources for its own profit, but does it in an open way and gives due credit to the person who is originally responsible, that is the native person, that is called as bioprospecting. So now we are looking at 2 similar terms. One is called bioprospecting. All that I've said till now is bioprospecting. What is it? Discovery and commercialization of new products based on biological resources. You can add here by giving due credit to the concerned person or community. Due credit to the community. Okay. When you don't do this, it's called as biopiracy. Simple. You use it for profit, but without permission, or little compensation, or no compensation, or no recognition. Then it becomes a biopiracy. So that's very clear. case study we have discussed about basmati, neem, and turmeric. We have. Yeah. So in terms of Act, the most important thing about Act is it has a 3-tier structure. 3-tier structure for processing applications related to transfer of knowledge. So national level, state level, and local body level. National level, it's called as National Biodiversity Authority. State level, it's called as State Biodiversity Board. Local level, it is called as Biodiversity Management Committees. Okay, national, state, just like the 3-tier of governance. The Biodiversity Authority also has. So NBA is based out of Chennai. I mean, the headquarters is in Chennai. And what it does is it processes application related to foreigners. So any person who is not a citizen of India, he applies. Applies for what? Applies for using the traditional knowledge for some purpose, or he was even wanting to access some research paper related to traditional Indian resources. That application is scrutinized by the NBA, okay, National Biodiversity Authority. State Biodiversity Board does it if the applicant is an Indian. That's all. So what do we have? This Biodiversity Management Committee. In the scrutinizing of application, they don't have any role. So it is either decided at the state level for Indians. Means if I am applying, then the State Biodiversity Board of Tamil Nadu will scrutinize my application. Okay. If someone from US is applying, then the NBA, the National Biodiversity Authority, will scrutinize. And in order to make it have a very strong deterrent effect, what they have done is any person who is caught under the National Biodiversity Act, the offense has been made non-bailable, just to make it act as a very strong deterrent, non-bailable. And if someone is caught, the punishment may be 5 years and a fine. It could be even be more than 10 years and a fine, based on the damage that has been caused. So it's a pretty stringent. It's been a pretty stringent. What should I say? Pretty stringent requirement. Yeah, under the Biodiversity Act. Yeah. Now I wanted to ask 1 or 2 questions. Firstly, whenever a patent happens, whenever suppose I file for a patent, okay, let's say I filed to USPTO, that is United States Patent and Trademark Office. Okay, I filed for a patent. Now, patent is given for anything that has what is called as a novelty factor. Novelty. It should be new, and it has not been done before. Now, how do patent office verify that it has not been done before? How do they verify? Yeah? Any idea? Do they verify? How do they verify? Because only after verification can they give a person a patent. As it happens, they have a database. They have what? A database. Database of all the inventions in that particular field. Means they have it very massive database. So if I put something in biochemistry, then they have a separate database for biochemistry. So in my abstract, when I'm submitting, I need to submit an abstract. You all understand abstract. You make a project report, the first page. It's generally an abstract which will also have keywords. So then they will search the keywords, they'll see the abstract, and if they feel that, yeah, at least we are not able to find it, then they process the application further. The patent granting itself takes a long time. Now, by the way, it takes as much as 3 to 5 years for the full patent cycle to be done. Okay. Now, suppose you as a civil servant, you have been appointed by the government of India, okay, to prevent spurious patents based on India's traditional knowledge. What are the things you think you can do? So the question is, you are a senior civil servant. India has received a lot of complaints. Sir, basmati is getting patented, turmeric is getting patented, neem is getting patented, and some of our Ayurvedic medicine, Unani medicine, they are getting patented. We need to stop it. In order to stop it, where will you start? What could be your first 1 or 2 steps? There is no right or wrong answer to it. make database of traditional knowledge. Okay, geographical indication tag. Okay. Any other answers? Anyone has anything else to say? In a way, both answers are correct, but the more comprehensive answer is that of database of the entire traditional knowledge, which is what the government of India has done. What? No, think about it. No? Why did the European Patent and Trademark Office give patent to that American company for patenting neem? Because what they would have done, they would have searched in their database. In that database, they could not find anything to do with neem applied on plants to prevent fungal infection. Simple. Now it becomes India's responsibility to give proof, which is what Vandana Shiva has done. But instead of one person doing it, how about the government collating all data of all the traditional knowledge? What do you think is the biggest challenge? Yeah, this is perhaps a relatively easier question. What do you think would be the biggest challenge of creating a database for all the medicinal systems? Ayurvedic, Unani, Siddha, homeopathy. What could be the biggest challenge in having such a database that Vaibhav says? Any one word answer or one sentence answer anyone can think of? Excellent, Abhishek. Most of them are in vernacular languages. Exactly, languages names, absolutely. If I take Siddha, traditionally Tamil Nadu medicine, it will all be in Tamil, not just will it be in Tamil, it will be on leaflets. You understand leaflets? It will be written on the leaflets. Ayurvedic, Unani, all are the respective languages and not digitized, which means your work as a civil servant becomes twofold. The first one is to translate respective language to English. But if you want it worldwide, you better use all the major United Nations language, which is English, French, Chinese, Arabic, Spanish. You translate it into 5. And not just that, you digitize them. There are 2 steps. Undigitized format in local language has to be converted in digitized format in 5 different languages spoken all over the world. The name for that initiative that we have just discussed is called as the Traditional Knowledge Digital Library. The reason why I gave this background is it's kind of a smooth transition from biodiversity to traditional knowledge digital library. So this is what I think pretty much we have covered all. So just to tell you the enormity of the work, it was translated into 34 million pages of text. Now, what do? You give this data to the various patent offices. So next time when someone talks about neem, the person types neem and he sees there's a lot of things related to neem written in either Siddha or Ayurveda or whichever. Okay, and the central collab and the whole thing was coordinated by the Ministry of Ayush and CSIR, Council for Scientific and Industrial Research. Now, it was not just there were 34 million pages of text. More importantly, it was classified as per the International Patent Classification System. So there is a classification system that needs to be followed, which is in tune, which is compatible with International Patent Classification System. That's all we have about Traditional Knowledge Digital Library. So if you look at it, Biodiversity Act 2002, Traditional Knowledge Digital Library 2001. There was another act by the Parliament called as Protection of Plant Varieties and Farmers' Rights Act 2001. In the same area of biodiversity conservation, but related to specific new or extant plant varieties, and it focuses on breeders, researchers, and farmers. Okay, so more or less, other points were kind of okay, self-explanatory. So I put the whole topic under self-study. Okay, since we are talking about biodiversity, and we have just touched upon National Biodiversity Act 2002, it becomes quite logical for us to study the Mother Act, the Global Act, yeah, the Convention on Biological Diversity. Where was this first you recall the connection between any summit or thing where the CPD was first concept of CPD was first formulated. Yeah, Rio Earth Summit, absolutely. Rio Earth Summit. So Rio Earth Summit, we had a lot of things. We had UNFCCC, we have Convention on Biodiversity, then we had Forest 21 Principles. We had some 3 plus 3, 6 important and sustainable development, conference on sustainable development. So we had 3 initiatives and 3 reports that were released. Go back to class 2 or class 3 and you will see that in one slide I had covered Rio, and at the bottom of the slide I would have given that Rio Summit gave 3 landmark initiatives and 3 reports, of which one initiative is the Convention on Biodiversity. Okay, so let's look at the goals. What are the goals? Kind of self-explanatory, but anyway, let's go through it. Since it is about biodiversity, obviously the first priority is conservation. Conservation of biological diversity. Conservation of biological diversity. That is the first goal. It's very logical. Okay. Now, by conservation, does it mean prohibition? That's the first thing that will come to our mind. Sorry. Does it mean prohibition? The answer is no. What does it actually back for or propose is sustainable use. Which means even the Convention on Biological Diversity is not so unpractical to say that completely ban use of all biodiversity. That's neither feasible nor desirable. So what they have done, conservation of biological diversity. The second objective being sustainable use of its components. So the word sustainable takes care of it everywhere. It means the rate at which you use should be much less than the rate of natural replenishment of that resource. Okay, that's a sustainable use. The third one is fair and equitable sharing of benefits. Fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from genetic resources. So here, if you look at it, you use it, but while using it, give credit to the people, native people from whom you have got that knowledge or the technology. So here, the first two, when I look at it, the first two are very clear, environment related. The second one is, to me, at least it is somewhat ethics related, isn't it? Give fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from genetic resources. So this is the 3 objectives of CPD. Then there are some parts when it entered into force and all that. It is this is important. It is considered as a key document regarding sustainable development. And it has 2 major subparts to it. The Convention on Biological Diversity has 2 major subparts to it. One is called as the Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety. And the other one is called as the Nagoya Protocol. So it's called as the Nagoya Protocol on access and benefit sharing. Nagoya Protocol on access and benefit sharing. First one is Cartagena Protocol on biosafety. By the way, these came very far away from each other. One came in 2000, other came in 2010. Cartagena Protocol. So Cartagena Protocol, as it says, it's a protocol on biosafety. Okay, so which means they were afraid that something could happen which could be a threat to the biological resources. What is that something? That something is defined in Cartagena Protocol as living modified organisms, which are also known as genetically modified organisms. Living modified. Living, the organism is living, but it is modified. Modified from what? Modified from its original gene structure, so to say. And therefore, it's same as calling it as genetically modified organisms. So, the protocol on biosafety, Cartagena Protocol on biosafety, therefore, what does it do? So, you come directly from here to here. It seeks to protect biodiversity from potential risks posed by genetically modified organisms, resulting from modern biotechnology. Yeah, is this clear? Now, genetically modified organisms, usually they are used for commercial purposes. Yeah, because we know what you can do. You can genetically modify it to give more productivity. Yeah, maybe drought tolerant, maybe pest resistant. There's so many things. But while doing it, all that you will do is you will destroy the native diversity. For example, if there is a cotton and the cotton itself is of 10 different varieties and it grows over, let's say, 10,000 hectares of land in the black soil region of India. And if you replace that entire diversity of cotton with one genetically modified cotton, which you claim will be pest resistant, drought tolerant, etc., all that is fine. But you will replace 10 different cotton varieties with one genetically modified cotton, which is not good from a biodiversity point of view, which is not even good from a human welfare point of view, because tomorrow, for some reason, there is a new variety of pest that attacks cotton. Earlier, there were 10 different varieties, so maybe 3 got affected. Now, there is just one variety. So, the entire 10,000 acres will be wiped out. Imagine you have an invasive species. We talked about the cotton mealy bug in the invasive alien species. Imagine there is a more virulent, virulent variety of cotton mealy bug. Maybe that destroys the entire cotton because genetically they are all replicas. The cotton is all replicas. Okay, so this is what the Cartagena Protocol talks about. The next one is Nagoya Protocol. Nagoya Protocol, as I said, it is about access and benefit sharing. So it says if someone utilizes so in fact, the other way is, if I look at it, the Cartagena Protocol is related to the first two, this and this. The Nagoya Protocol is about the third objective. That's an easier way to look at it. Cartagena Protocol helps you to implement the first two objectives of CPD. Nagoya Protocol is helping you to achieve the third objective of CPD. And if you remember in one of the classes, I also said this 2011 to 2020 has been declared as the United Nations Decade on Biodiversity. Okay? So this is the United Nations Decade on Biodiversity. And 2010 was the International Year. On biodiversity. International Year on Biodiversity. So suffice for you to just remember that when we are talking about biodiversity, it's important to know Cartagena Protocol, Nagoya Protocol. There is also something called as the Aichi Biodiversity Target, which is nothing but 20 targets related to conservation of biodiversity. Okay. And this Aichi Biodiversity Target was adopted in the Nagoya Conference in 2010. So three things: CPD, Cartagena Protocol, Nagoya Protocol, and Nagoya Protocol is related to the Aichi Biodiversity Target, which was part of the Nagoya Conference held in 2010. Okay, so now we'll move on to some current affairs part, which is also linked to the static part. Okay. Asian waterbird census. So this was taken the month of January. So water bird. So when I say water bird, it is very clear that where do you find water bird? Where you have water. But what kind of water? Usually it is around wetlands. Okay. So this was a census taken in certain parts of Andhra Pradesh by the Bombay Natural History Society. So whenever you come across an article like this, it's very important for you to at least look at, okay, so if you don't know about this organization, better to do some Google research and find it out. That's a way in which you can integrate a lot of things. Okay, so let's go point by point. Andhra Pradesh, fine, but Bombay Natural History Society is important. It's an integral part of International Waterbird Census. So, which means, okay, Asian Waterbird Census is a subset of International Waterbird Census, coordinated by Wetlands International. So this is very important. So you'll find Wetlands International is actually an American NGO. This is an NGO. This is also an NGO. Okay, so this is how sometimes questions are asked. You don't know why they asked something, but somewhere you could figure out from the current affairs why they asked. Okay. So what is the objective? Why do we have to have a census? So one very obvious thing is you need to find the population and compare the population with the previous time to see whether there's an increasing trend, whether it's stable or whether it's a declining trend. That's one simple objective of any census. Okay. But the other objective is to also look at many of these birds are usually migratory in nature and try to understand those wetlands which are more important from the bird's conservation point of view. So, and that's the objective that is mentioned here. One objective is population, which you have discussed. Other is to identify wetlands of high importance for water birds. Okay. And now, if there are a lot of water birds that are coming to a specific wetlands, and that wetland is turning out to be important from a conservation point of view, it could also be made as a Ramsar site at a later stage. In fact, if you look at it, when I was teaching environment in 2017, I remember the number of Ramsar sites in India was 27. Okay. Now, when I look at it, it is 47. Within 4 years, it has jumped drastically. Okay. So, it is because of several census of this type, due to which more and more sites are getting included under Ramsar sites. Okay. So, that's on the Ramsar site. Then comes this term called flyway network site. Flyway network site is very simple. When a bird flies, if you remember, I had, I think it was about radiation pollution. When I talk about Amur falcons, starting from, let's say, the northeastern part of India, coming all the way up to Africa and going back and all that. Flyway network site is nothing but when a bird is flying, it cannot fly uninterrupted. There is a source, there is a destination. So it will stop by at typical places, some important places. And usually those important places happen to be wetlands. Okay. They could even be paddy fields. They could even be a very small lake, maybe a 1 acre lake, maybe, but the birds continuously come and sit there, possible. So all those sites which come in the route of the migratory birds, they are called the flyway network sites. That's all. Okay, so that's the other objective. Now let's look at the more important point from a prelims point of view. All these are from prelims point of view. So let me ask you a question. When you read this statement, okay, today I'm asking a lot of big questions. If you read this statement as a civil service aspirant, what will you do? So you have just read the statement called the study covered at least 2 dozen sites, including Koringa Wildlife Sanctuary, Koleru Lake, and Krishna Sanctuary. As a civil service aspirant, what will you do? I mean, you can say what you do. One, the acceptable answer is skip. You may skip the line if you don't like. Location means what, Prachi? You will. All 3 lie to the south of India. Find out where they are. You're right, Abhishek. All 3 lie to the south of India, and it is not kind of very difficult because all 3 are parts of Andhra Pradesh. Okay. So one thing that I strongly encourage you is to take your atlas, or better go to the Google map and then see where is this. Koringa Wildlife Sanctuary. Any idea? So it is related to birds, absolutely birds. So what do you think? Where would birds come? They are coming to wetland. Now wetland, logic, there are some exceptions, but generally you find a lot of wetlands in where, as in, yeah, I think let me keep the answer question is like, where do you find a lot of wetlands? One place where you will find wetlands, exactly, it is near sea for sure, absolutely near the sea. It is around the river delta or estuary, but not always. It could be a lake also. For example, you have this Pichavaram marshy lands or mangroves. It is somewhat in Tamil Nadu. You have Bhitarkanika, you have Sundarbans. So you have a lot of wetlands which are usually in the delta or the estuary regions. Okay, yeah, delta or the estuary regions. So similarly, Koringa Wildlife, what do you think? Which, any idea where it is? Want me to see? Yeah, here you go. Can someone tell me the river? Has it already been told? Yeah, true, very true. Kakinada. Can someone tell me the river? Very close, Sagarika. Kakinada. Therefore, logically, what do you think is the river? Abhishek, you should be able to tell this. Godavari. Exactly. Excellent, guys. Godavari is the right answer. So if you just look at it, let me spend a little time over here so that you see the map and you feel really comfortable. Okay, it's very close to Kakinada to Koringa. So if someone has to go to Koringa, he has to go to Kakinada. So that's why I think Sagarika has mentioned it. Okay, so let's just stick to it. So one is Koringa Wildlife Sanctuary. Then comes your next one, what they are saying, Koleru Lake and Krishna Sanctuary. Okay, so Koleru Lake. Koleru. Again, Andhra Pradesh. It is between the Godavari and the Krishna Delta. Are you able to see this? Godavari is here, Krishna is here. And Koleru Lake is somewhere in between. You can roughly say between the deltaic region of, between the deltaic region of Krishna and Godavari. Okay, good. So just please do this whenever you get a chance. Now, when you read this article, when you read a newspaper article like this, this is a sample in which you could dissect the article. One way is to read the article and say, hey, I finished the current affairs for today. Try to avoid that. Try to avoid that. Create those interlinkages. Do something so that the information can go into your long-term memory. Okay. So I felt that all these are important. Bombay Natural History. Maybe not all of us know that there is an NGO which is a very old NGO, 19th century NGO, and also is very important for two censuses. One is Asian waterbird census. Another is a national dragonfly census, which we will discuss in a minute. Wetland International NGO I got. Then I always knew Ramsar site. Let's say I'm a diligent civil service aspirant, I knew Ramsar site, but this flyway network was little new to me. Okay, so I learned this thing from them. Koringa Wildlife, I roughly knew it is in Andhra Pradesh, but I was not sure whether it is Godavari or Krishna. I figured out that it is Godavari, and I feel a little comfortable. Koleru Lake. Now, Koleru Lake, sometimes it happens that I got confused with Koneru. Koneru is a Karnataka place. In fact, Koneru Hampi, the chess player. Hampi is also named place. So I got confused between Koleru and Koneru. It happens when you read a lot. I've been there, done that. Krishna Sanctuary is clear. So I have a rough idea of which part of Andhra Pradesh we are talking about. And the article does not stop there. It just mentions in a line casually that the endangered Indian skimmer was also under focus. Endangered. Now, when I looked at endangered, as an aspirant, first time aspirant, I said, okay, what is endangered? I Google it and I find out what is endangered. Indian skimmer, I don't know what an Indian skimmer is. So I just Google and find out the image of it. Then I find who defines endangered, who tells whether it is endangered or not endangered. Then I figure out that there is an organization called IUCN. So as I go deep, it pulls me deeper. Yeah, that's a classic dilemma that many of the civil service aspirants face. How deep should I go? How wide should I go? There is no right answer to it. Yeah. Okay. So now Indian skimmer is endangered. So anything that is endangered or critically endangered, you need to know about. That's a fundamental. Vulnerable, no problem. Yeah. Threatened is a combination. We'll come to IUCN classification. Threatened means it's a combination of vulnerable, endangered, and critically endangered. All three are put together called as threatened. But endangered, definitely you should know. Critically endangered, definitely you should know. Okay. Other things you need not know. A few points about it. What is an Indian skimmer? Where they are found? What were they earlier called as? And all. Okay. And some interestingly, they are also found in National Champal Sanctuary in India. Now, whenever you say National Champal Sanctuary, crocodile, Gharial is the first thing that comes to your mind. But it seems that for the Indian Caesarbill or for this Indian skimmer, the National Champal Sanctuary is also a place where they regularly visit. Okay, so how does an Indian skimmer look? Okay, I just take a picture and I'll tend to remember it. Dark orange beaks and white body and black wings. It's a easy bird to spot. Apparently, I somehow have a feeling that I have seen this bird in some of the Chennai-based bird sanctuaries, outskirts of Chennai-based bird sanctuaries also. That's the first feel I got when I saw this image. Then what do I do? Of all the things, I have somewhat mapped all the important things. One thing that I have yet to map is, okay, what is this Bombay Natural History Society? Then I take 3-4 points about the Bombay Natural History Society. So I am pleasantly surprised. Achha, so this is the largest NGO, or at least one of the largest NGO. Okay, so that's an additional point for my knowledge. And then one thing is the water bird census. What is the other big thing it does? It conducts the National Dragonfly Festival, apparently. And there are 2-3 points about National Dragonfly Festival that I write. So when I write National Dragonfly Festival, again I figure out that, oh, okay, it is not doing it alone, it is doing it with other big NGOs and multilateral organizations like WWF, UNEP, and National Biodiversity Board of India. So one article just called as there has been a census of water bird. How deep you can go is purely a function of how interested you are and how much time you have. That also I agree, because that's a genuine challenge that we face. Hopefully, through our classes, we are trying to reduce that burden to some extent. I won't say I'm trying to do that 100%. It's not possible for any person. But at least if I can reach 75-80% of, save 75-80% of your time, and through class, if you learn, I think my purpose would have been served. Good. Now, in this, we saw this thing about IUCN. Yeah. So I thought it is appropriate. We also try to understand the concept of the International Union for Conservation of Nature, and then try to see how some more points about IUCN in general. Yeah, BirdLife International does that. You're right. Yeah, BirdLife International will get involved because anything about birds, BirdLife International gets involved. And BirdLife International is somewhat associated or a sister organization of the IUCN itself. We'll see about BirdLife International when we talk about IUCN. Okay, IUCN's list of threatened species. So a lot of points here. So one thing for sure is that these guys are the encyclopedia when it comes to the conservation status of biological species. So they are the so-called undisputed leaders or highly respected organization when it comes to the biological conservation status. Okay. And why are they so popular? Because they have a very clear evaluation criteria to evaluate the extinction risk. Yeah, what is the extinction risk of various species, and they do this for both the flora as well as fauna. Okay. Now, what are the objectives? What does the red list do? So, red list itself is an indication that it is in danger. The red signifies danger of threatened species. So, we will try to understand what threatened is in a minute. But what they are actually looking for is threatened species, which is actually a combination of vulnerable, endangered, and critically endangered. So threatened is a sum of these things: vulnerable, endangered, and critically endangered. So the first question that comes is, why should we have a red list in the first place? So why should we have a red list? First point, let's look at the first point: to provide scientifically based information on the status of species, subspecies at a global level. Because humanity is at the top of the food pyramid. We are an omnivore and we sit on the top level. So anything that happens to any level below us will have an impact on us. And we need to precisely estimate the impact in a scientifically sound manner. And how do we do that? Through IUCN. So that's the first point. Provide scientifically based. So it's not based on hearsay, it is based on science, it is based on experiments. So once you provide this information, okay, suppose in IUCN red list, I'm just saying, IUCN red list says 20 species of bees worldwide are facing extinction. It will shake the government, because bees are gone means 4 years the entire human population will be gone, for Albert Einstein. So the first objective is linked to the second objective. By providing scientifically based information, what do you do? Draw attention to the magnitude and importance of the threatened biodiversity. This is quite logical. Yeah. And now, once you have shown that 20 species of bees are going to get extinct, you have drawn attention to the magnitude of the problem. And then, let's say the European countries are now struggling to form policies on how to protect the bees. So they have banned certain pesticides, which means effectively what you have done, you have been able to influence the policy and decision making. You start with a scientific approach, highlight the problem, influence the national and the international governments to have a policy or a decision making to reverse the trend. And finally, it is possible that the government, when it wants to implement, it wants some more data, some more advice, and some more implementation support. That is also provided by these guys to provide actions to information, to guide actions. Yeah, so all the four objectives are logical. You start with the scientific information, draw attention, and then you influence the national and the international policy and decision making and provide information to guide actions for conserving biological diversity. Now, what does the red list include? So what I've done here, I have mentioned 7 abbreviations. So I'll call this as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. And then there is an 8 and 9 also. But let's look at the 7 first. IUCN's red list of threatened species. So what does IUCN mean by threatened species? These 3 guys. Vulnerable, endangered, critically endangered. First one, very clear. So let's start with this guy. EX, I think it's very obvious, it is extinct. Okay. If EX is extinct, what is EW then? Any idea what is EW? Can someone tell me, is there a difference between EX and EW? Extinct in wild, excellent. So it means that they are not found in their natural habitat, but they are still there in the zoos. They are alive, but not in their natural habitat. So that's why the name extinct in their wild, extinct in the natural habitat. Okay. Then comes your CR is critically endangered. Critically endangered means it is almost at the stage of becoming extinct. And hence the adjective critically is critically endangered. EN is endangered. And for all of this, there is an IUCN criteria. I'm not going into the criteria, it may become a little complicated. Then we use vulnerable, means so far the species is okay, but due to certain changes in the ecological condition of that region, it is likely to be vulnerable. Okay. Now, what will happen is, suppose there is a species which is endemic to a region. Are you able to understand endemic? For example, Nilgiri tar. It's endemic to the southern part of Nilgiris. Okay. Now, as is, there is no problem actually. Yeah, but very quickly Nilgiri tar can become vulnerable if there is some ecological change, either man-made or natural. That is vulnerable. And what is NT? Any idea? NT? NT stands for? Abbreviation NT stands for? Near threatened. Excellent. Good guys. Near threatened. And LC? The last one, LC? Least concern. Excellent. Yeah. So now you can see from least concern to extinct. Okay. So many of these species, and we will see some of those species. In fact, if you want, what the IUCN has done, it has classified 132 species of plants and animals from India as critically endangered. Means your category number 5, this one. 132 species as critically endangered. Now, if you ask me, do I have to really remember all of this? It is important as much as you can remember, but especially if something is in news, you should remember. Not just the name, but some aspects related to the news. For example, the reason I believe why Great Indian Bustard was asked, one of the endangered species, the critically endangered species, which was also in news, a very heavy flying bird in the western part of India and all that. Indian vulture, you would have heard about this in one form or the other. Rameshwaram parachute spider, I've never heard of it actually. Yeah, but it is called critically endangered. Himalayan quail. Wayanad mahseer. What is mahseer? Any idea? Wayanad mahseer, what is this? Similarly, Himalayan quail, what is it? Fish or mammal or reptile or? Wayanad mahseer is a fish, you are right. Yeah, quail is a bird. Himalayan quail is a bird. Excellent. It's a bird. Pondicherry shark. I'm so close to Pondicherry, I didn't know that it had sharks, but it does, and they are critically endangered. Ganges shark, Gharial we know, red-crowned roof turtle we know, several species of frogs, Himalayan wolf, Nicobar shrew. Any idea? What does it? What is a shrew? Nicobar shrew. Nicobar is the region where it is found. Shrew. Yeah, very good. Small animal which looks like a rat, but it is classified as a mammal. Very good, Prachi. Nicobar shrew. Malabar civet. Civet is, I don't know if it's pronounced as civet. C-I-V. Cat. Yeah, like a cat. Absolutely. Civet is a cat. It has this glowing. In fact, all cat families have the glowing eyes. Kashmir stag. This many of you will be doing it. Yeah, deer. Absolutely. Yeah, kind of deer. Yeah, we could say that one of the species of deer or deer family, if I may call so. Okay, great. Now, where were we? Has anyone seen deer of late? Means physically in person. Have you seen it up close, like 10 feet away from you? Road crossing. Where have you seen Harsh? You see deer in Bareilly? Prachi, how about you? Nagpur, do you have? UK, okay. UK is fine, but Tadoba you have seen. Yeah, that's quite possible. Rishikesh you have seen. Okay, good. So in case you want to see deers in a city, I welcome you all to IIT Madras. By the way, IIT Madras has a lot of deers. You can, and not just deers, it also has black bucks. It's wonderful seeing them jump from one place to another. Going to Madhya Pradesh by road, yeah, quite possible. Madhya Pradesh by road, okay. So from Nagpur, Madhya Pradesh, yeah, I think that's a forest area. In fact, my first project in my previous company, KPMG, it was at a place called, do you guys know this place? A place called Tiroda. Tiroda was my first project, an Adani power plant. So I landed in Nagpur, and from Nagpur, it was like 4 hours by car. Very remote place, but beautiful place. So you can find deers there for sure. Okay. So all these guys who which is mentioned here is in the category of critically endangered. Now, under which category would you place human beings? Just asking out of curiosity. We have to create a new category. Yeah, least concern. Maybe we have a category called troublesome, and we put human beings under the category. Yeah, it would come least bothered. Exactly, Abhishek. That's what my point was also. And where would you keep the category of good human beings under the 7? Just for joke purpose, I'm saying now. Don't quote me anywhere. Good human beings is C. What is C? Critically endangered. Okay. Yeah, possible. At least I'm happy you're not calling them as extinct. Yeah. Okay. Good human beings are prone to hunters. Okay. And the hunters are human beings themselves. Yeah. Okay. Great. Now let's get back to some of the important points about the red list itself. One thing I wanted to remember, I found it very fascinating, was so what IUCN has done. They had 3 or 4. In fact, they do it very frequently. But if you look at it in their website and even in Wikipedia, the last release, so to say, was 2012. Okay, 2012 release they call it. But the most recent one also happens to be 2019. So I've taken the 2019 value, and they found that too many numbers, but you can just remember it as 1 lakh. Out of 1 lakh, approximately 30K is considered at the risk of extinction. 30% is at the risk of extinction. And in this 30,000, no, not in this 37. The way you should see is the species that is most impacted is amphibians, guys. I think that's one point I just want you to remember. Amphibians are the ones which are most threatened. The 41% of all amphibian species of the world are under threat. Imagine. That's very scary, no? That's very scary. For example, in this case, do we have an amphibian species? Yeah, we have frogs. Turtle is also amphibian, right? So at least these 2 guys are amphibian. 33% of reef building corals. 30% of conifers. Yeah, the pine trees in the temperate forest. 25% of mammals and 13% of birds. So if at all there is a question around which of the below are maximum under threat with respect to their population. So it is amphibian. 41% under threat as per IUCN. So that's an important term. So I would strongly urge you to love all the frogs and the turtles and not get scared by them, or not should you scare them. Okay, great. Anything missing in this? Yeah, I think more or less covered. Yeah, so we have discussed 7. 2. So total, in terms of categories, I would say there are 7 categories plus 2, or you can say there are 9 categories. The plus 2 are 2 categories where we are not able to classify. A, the data was deficient. B, there was a call not to take an evaluation for whatever purpose. So there are category 8 and 9, data deficient and not evaluated. Data deficient and not evaluated. Now, since we were talking about good human beings or great human beings, I know some person has very nicely defined great human. I think I may be losing the context. I don't know, some of the book lovers can help me. Abhishek, correct me if I'm wrong. It says something like a good or a great human being is one. Yeah, I got it. A great human being is a person who does the right thing when no one is seeing. It's such a beautiful thought. No? A great person is one who does the right thing when no one is seeing. Because generally, the human nature is we tend to be good, especially when it comes to others or showing off others. Yeah. You always say, wow, he has a wonderful personality. Yeah. Personality is what you show to the world or what the world sees you. But there is a term related to personality which is much more deeper than personality. Can you tell me what word am I looking at? It is synonymous to personality, but it is slightly different from personality, which defines the core of the person. Any idea? Exactly. Excellent, Vaibhav. Character. Yeah. So personality is to the outside, character is to the inside. Only you know your character. Outside world knows your personality. Okay. So just remember this term and maybe try to use it in ethics or in essay wherever they ask a philosophical question. Okay. So when I talked about the 2019 yeah. So here we are talking about the 2019 assessment. No? There was a 2012 assessment of IUCN, which was released along with what came to be known as the Rio Plus 20 Earth Summit. So the 2012 survey itself, there is nothing great about it, but I thought the Rio Plus 20 Earth Summit is something that you need to know. So what happened was, we all know that the Rio Summit happened in the year 1992. Okay. Then in Johannesburg, South Africa, 2002, Johannesburg, South Africa, 2002, there was World Conference on Sustainable Development. In fact, in Rio, if you remember, one was UNFCCC. The second one was Convention on Biodiversity. The third one was your sustainable development. These were the 3 themes. Okay. So this Rio is also linked to sustainable development. The next conference on sustainable development, means exclusive conference on sustainable development, happened 10 years after Rio, which is in Johannesburg. The next conference on sustainable development once again happened in Rio. So 10. So 10 plus 10, 20. So this is called as Rio plus 20. So let me write it mathematically. Mathematically, this is wrong, but Rio equal to Rio plus 20. What does this mean? Rio in 2012 happened 20 years after Rio in 1992. So in case you come across the term, what is this Rio plus 20? This is what the whole story is. It is nothing but after 20 years, the summit once again happened in Rio, focusing on the concept of sustainable development. At that time, the IUCN also released one of its releases. Okay. Now, BirdLife International has, which is also related to the IUCN and specifically focuses on the conservation status of birds and the enumeration of birds also. They have, they are using a word called possibly extinct. Possibly extinct. So now, possibly extinct does not come in these 7. does not come in these 7. But what BirdLife International is proposing is that this critically endangered can be replaced with possibly extinct. It is proposing that. Some say it has been accepted, some say I have not seen the confirmation in many places, but just have it at the back of your mind that when someone is saying possibly extinct, it corresponds to critically endangered. Critically endangered. Then some facts about IUCN, guys, boring as it may sound, but it is important, guys. IUCN, I may have touched this upon earlier. Whenever you talk about biodiversity, conservation, and all that, this guy comes in very prominently. UNESCO. Yeah. Anyway, it is the World Heritage, all that is anyway part of UNESCO. But even your biodiversity conservation or organizations related to biodiversity conservation are somewhat related to UNESCO. So IUCN was also established in 1948 as part of UNESCO. And the concept of red list has been going on since 1964. Okay. And the IUCN has an observer and consultative status at the UN. Since we are talking about IUCN, biodiversity conservation, enumeration of species, critically endangered, extinct in the wild, and extinct, it's important to talk about this very famous book called The Sixth Extinction, The Unnatural History. The purpose is not really to talk about the book per se, but the theme that she argues in the book. Yeah, so the author's name is Elizabeth Kolber. She has many hats, one of them being that of a journalist. So she argues that the Earth is in the midst of a modern man-made sixth extinction, which is to say that we are already part of sixth extinction. And she researches very well. This is, by the way, one of the well-recommended books on anyone interested on conservation. And she gives a perspective going back to anthropology. What were the earlier 5 extinctions? And she compares the status of the environment and ecology at the 5th extinction with the status of environment and ecology at 6th extinction and draws broad parallels between both. And she says, in all probability, we are actually in the midst of the 6th extinction. Very scary as it may sound, but that is what she says. The only thing is the fundamental difference between the 5th extinction and the 6th extinction is the 5th extinction was caused due to natural reasons. The 6th extinction is primarily driven by. That I just touch upon this concept. So whenever someone is talking about 6th extinction means the 6th extinction caused by human beings. 6th extinction and unnatural history is a book by this author, which also talks about the same concept. Okay, some of the extinct species, I think you should spend some time. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I clearly remember this issue of the West African black rhino becoming extinct. Yeah, so this was in the. So the last letter in this one is S. So they're writing as 2010s. So it may be a little confusing. Pinta giant tortoise. Rock snail. Yeah, see, look at this amphibian now. I think there is a good parallel here. No? This is an amphibian. This is an amphibian. Lake nude. This guy looks like an amphibian to me. The botany guys can correct me if I'm wrong. Caspian tiger is okay. Flying fox. The avian species. Darter. Mammal. Marsupial. What they call it. Butterfly. Tiger. Yeah, so you have across all, yeah, you have across all. I think Caspian tiger has been noted twice. Yeah, this day is also noted twice. There's some, okay, it's leaving aside the reputation. I think there are a good number of species that have become extinct. The first known extinct species was actually somewhere in the 18th century itself. This is the guy whom you, every time you just Google, extinct species, this is the name that will appear. Who is this guy? Dodo? Any idea? How does he look? He or she looks. Yeah, dodo is a bird which will somewhat look like a duck. Yeah, it will somewhat look like the They spotted Tasmania tiger recently. Huh? Yes, you are right, Vaibhav. I think they spotted Tasmania tiger. You are right. You are right. Thanks for bringing that to this. But it's happening. But overall, you can just have a look at it. This one I very clearly remember. It wasn't used in a big way, and therefore the focus was on Kaziranga. Okay, for our one-horned rhinoceros. Okay, so that's the extinct species. Now that brings us to wetland convention. See, I also want you to just have a look at how we are trying to connect facts. All this, there is a reason why it is coming in this sequence. We started off with the Asian water bird census. Yeah. From that, we went to Bombay Natural History. From there, we went to IUCN. We also went to the maps. Then we went, because it is water bird census, we talked about wetlands. Therefore, we are going to wetlands. So this is an integrated way of preparing where you try to connect the points so that you can remember better. I know I have repeated this n number of times, but this is extremely crucial for you to have a good long-term memory of these facts. Okay, wetland convention, Ramsar convention. Now, can someone tell me which country proposed this concept? The question is, which country proposed this? Okay, Iran. Ramsar is in Iran. That's the right answer. I think got it right. The concept that wetland habitat needs to be protected, okay, it gained international importance when in US there is this bird called waterfowl. Do you know what a waterfowl is? What does it look like? In local language, if I see a waterfowl, what am I most likely to call it as? Any idea? It is this. Oh, good. Yeah, duck. It is a duck. Okay. So in US, there was a drastic decline in the waterfowl population in the 60s and in the early 70s. That's how the Ramsar Convention was signed in 71 and it came into force in 75. So it is a duck. Why do you think the population of duck was decreasing drastically in US? Any guess? Educated guess? In the 50s and 60s, the duck population was decreasing. Why do you think the population is decreasing? The answer is it is not related to environment. Okay, wetlands are decreasing. I thought that it was, let me say it was meat eating, okay, somewhat close weather. But why only waterfowl? Meat eating means they have so many other organisms, no? Some walking, some jumping, some climbing. So people eat all kinds of meats. Why only waterfowl? I mean, I don't believe that they were extremely tasty as compared to some of the other. No, they were not. They were not. That's what I'm saying. I'll give you a clue. The reason why I'm not telling you answer, I really want you to think. The reason for decrease in waterfowl, the root cause, is a big problem in US. That's the clue. The reason for decrease in waterfowl, the root cause, is a big problem which sometimes gets manifested on the roads, in the schools, exactly, hunting. And the problem is, this gun culture, exactly. The gun culture in US and hunting. If you typically look at any average size US family, the weekends are gone either fishing or even hunting. So for hunting, they actually take their guns and go. So hunting is part of their culture. If you read Obama's book, there is this nice book called Audacity of Hope. There is a part 2 also. I read part 1 several years back. He tackles this issue of gun culture in US and why it is so difficult to kind of have a legislation for gun control. So it's very interesting. If you look at it, when this incident in New Zealand happened, I hope you're aware that gunman killing a lot of people in a place of worship. So Jacinda Ardern, the PM, was very quick and she very swiftly acted and she put a very comprehensive gun control law. So that was like a wow factor for many in US because many in US have been trying for several decades. Just a related point I thought you should know, and perhaps this is the way you can remember and make it more interesting. Okay, so the whole thing started about hunting, having possession of guns, and the people were shooting this ducks. I am not sure. I'm not sure whether an English phrase also came from this. Now it's easy to shoot a duck. Okay, what do you think is the English phrase that came from this? I don't know. My question may not be very clear, but it is easy to shoot a duck because it cannot run fast. So, what is the English phrase from this? Let me write it for you. Have you heard this phrase, guys? Has anyone heard this? It says, "We became sitting ducks." Yeah, when the firing was on, for whatever reason. If you have not, this is a very commonly used phrase in English. We became sitting ducks. Yeah, helpless. We became sitting ducks because we were immobile and we were just in the line of fire. Anyway. Yeah, more than caught unaware, I think it is, yeah, it basically means that we became easy targets. We became easy targets. Okay, so that's the meaning of sitting ducks. Okay, now sticking to ducks, one more last thing so that before we move on. Okay, so this is the guy waterfowl. Okay, I believe that gone for a duck. I am not sure if that duck is this duck, Harsha. Gone for a duck. Maybe I don't know. I'm not really researched on this. I'll research and get back to you in the next class. Gone for a duck. Okay. Now, I have this kind of another chutkula, as they say in Hindi, if I pronounce it correctly. Another thing for you, question for you is, as civil service aspirants, okay, you need to get inspired from the duck. You may be surprised, what, sir? At least they'll get inspired from tiger or leopard. I want to be a tiger and fight crime. Fair enough. But you also have to be duck. You need to imbibe one particular feature of the duck, which will make sure that you are sustainable as a civil servant for the remaining part of your career. What is one thing that you think you can learn from a duck? Not just learn and make it your personality trait also. I think it's a tough one. I'll give you something. Does the duck swim? Let's quickly do it. Does the duck swim in terms of yes or no? It does. Okay. Now the next question is, does it swim effortlessly? Means when you see a duck, how do you see it? Do you see it going like this, or do you see it going smoothly, like smooth or rough? Or effortless or effortlessly? Sorry, effortlessly or with a lot of effort? Smooth, yeah. So Prachi says smooth. Now what I ask you to do is that you take the camera, yeah, from the top of the water and bring the camera to slightly below the water. And you are seeing the paddles of the duck. Now what is your observation? Yeah, it moves the leg vigorously. Moves the leg vigorously. But to the outside world, it kind of gives a nice smile. That says, hey, I'm cool. Yeah, above it looks calm and below it paddles fast. Now, as a civil servant, future civil servant, this is one trait of personality that will help you. There may be million bombs that may be bursting in your heart and mind. Yeah, you have let's say, some problem with the family, your boss is completely atrocious, your minister keeps troubling you, but you have a darbar, let's say grievances. You collect the grievances of people at 9 a.m. At least you should put up a smile. Yeah, you can't go so tense that the people who have come to the darbar say, "Sir, can I help you?" You look very tense. That will be a sad thing to do. You may say, "But sir, at the end of the day, we are all human beings." That's true. But you could train yourself to be calm. I am no great in this myself. Okay, so whatever is there in my heart, it will come out in my face. Very clearly come out in my face. But if you can train yourself to be calm, either through meditation or through, if you remember, going a little philosophical, if you remember that I told about 4 D's for civil service preparation. The 4th D was the most important D, which is detachment. It is not at all easy. I can tell you, it is not at all easy. The biggest of the pain comes from the closest of the members. Yeah, but try to be as much as detached as you can, which can bring in the calmness and which can give you the necessary energy to face the situation. So I felt that the beauty that we can understand from the duck is, despite its enormous effort that it puts to paddle, it looks as if it is going very smooth. Yeah, the other conclusion that I draw is, do not be envious of others. Maybe this is the second, what should I say, conclusion. You may think, oh wow, he's an IAS, yeah. Maze ki zindagi hai. He's just enjoying life. No, maybe it's very painful. You think he's going in a red siren car and there is police, there is a security officer, all that, but you have no idea what he or she is going through. Same with police. Same with any profession for that matter. Civil service obviously is a more glorified and decorated service, but every person is same with richness. Wow, he's a billionaire. Yeah. What does he have to do? Maybe he has to do. Maybe he has gone through so much pain that you and I don't know. Maybe we don't know. Today, Elon Musk is a billionaire, but I'm sure there have been days when he has mentioned in his biography that he has slept on a couch and they had only one computer. So morning someone else was using it. So morning he will do something and night he will use a computer, and that's how he is what he is. Anyway, so that's about the wetland convention. As Prachi rightly said, the Ramsar, that city is in Iran, but the initial impetus, the force to have this Ramsar convention came from United States. So a couple of points here. UNESCO serves as the depository. Where is the bureau, the secretariat, all of that is there. India comes in India signed the convention in 1981. And what is most important about this convention is it includes the concept of wetland. It gives a very broad definition of the concept of wetland. One easy way to remember is, at least I remember, is in Ramsar Convention, whatever land is wet, it is called as wetland. Because when I saw that it includes something like this, paddy fields as wetland, then I remembered, okay, so during irrigation time, suddenly the wetland time in India will, the wetland area in India will increase. Fish ponds, that is still okay. Salt pans, you understand salt pans? If anyone has been in Chennai and goes towards from Chennai to Pondicherry, you will find that there are salt pans on both sides of the road. Yeah, the way they extract salt from the seawater. Estuaries, oases in the desert, estuaries, deltas, tidal flats, mangroves, all of them, coral reefs, all of them is considered under wetlands. So it's a very, very broad definition. What is important from a prelims point of view is points like this. It's not legally binding and it is not part of UN. Approximate numbers, you can remember, more than 2,000 Ramsar sites covering 2 million square kilometers. More than 2,000 Ramsar sites covering 2 million square kilometers. India has 47 Ramsar sites. And I've just taken it from the Environment Ministry. If you remember NVIS, you recollect NVIS, the Environmental Information System, which is part of the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change. So there they have a record of 47 Ramsar sites. And I just saw that out of this 47, as I said, 20 of them have got added between 19, 20, and 21. That is 2019, 20, and 21. And what is so under Ramsar site, there is a record of those kinds of what should I say? Those kinds of land which are endangered, which are under risk. What is that risk? A, changes in ecological character have occurred, okay, or are occurring. So this is the past, have occurred, past, or occurring present, likely to occur in future. So they've included all three categories. As a result of what? Mainly human interference. So human interference, if it is there, either it could get manifested itself as technology or pollution or any other depth. Okay. So Montreux record is a register of wetlands on the list of wetlands of international importance. So not on all wetlands. It's a list of wetlands on the list of wetlands of international importance. So Montreux record is somewhat, if you look at it approximately, it is like your biodiversity hotspot. Somewhat. Yeah. There also, what did we say? We told that biodiversity hotspots are those where you have very high biodiversity, having a lot of endemic species, but they have lost 70% of the habitat. Somewhat synonymous to that is the Montreux record. In India, there are two wetlands which are part of the Montreux record. I'm pronouncing it as Montreux, but it's a French word. I don't know how they pronounce it slightly differently, but this is my basic pronunciation. So there are two of these wetlands. Keoladev National Park, also called as the Bharatpur Bird Sanctuary earlier, Rajasthan, and Loktak Lake in Manipur. So anyone who has been in Delhi would know that people make weekend trips to this Bharatpur bird sanctuary. It's a nice weekend getaway for many of the Delhiites. And there are some parts that I have mentioned about about the wetland. One point I also wanted to mention: wherever there is a wetland, no, will it? What do you think? Will it cause more flooding in the adjacent area, or will it actually protect the adjoining areas from flooding? Yeah, protect. Very good question. It will protect. That's the beauty of wetland, because it will. The, once the water flows over the wetland, no, it will absorb it. Yeah. So once it starts absorbing, more and more water flow will flow in all directions. So that's the beauty of having a wetland. So in this case also, it protects this Bharatpur in Rajasthan from frequent floods. Why this came under this Montrix record was in 2007, I think. Oh yeah, I mentioned it. In 2007, there was a severe drought in the entire region. Rajasthan droughts, we can relate to it, and it was the drought resulted in the decrease in the water table of the entire area. So once the water table decreases, what happens? The wetland is more wet. It's only a land, and therefore it has an impact on the local ecosystem. Because once the drought, the water level comes down, the migratory nature of the birds would not come. But that's only one part. The greenery is lost, as a result of which grazing land for the cattle is lost. The groundwater table itself falls down. Therefore, the human beings are also impacted. That's about the Keoladev National Park and why it got into the Montrix record. The more interesting lake is the Loktak Lake. Incidentally, I had a chance of witnessing Loktak Lake while the flight was landing in Manipur. It's such a beautiful sight. You must. I couldn't go to the lake, but I will next time if I get a chance. So it is in Manipur, not very far away from Imphal. There are a lot of names to it. This is called as a pulsating lake. Why pulsating? Because the area of the lake is two different. Yeah, it is during rainy season. It goes up. During the summer season, it comes down. So it's called as a pulsating lake. A couple of points on this. It has the world's only floating national park. What is it? Keibul Lamjung National Park. And the Keibul Lamjung National Park is nothing but, in local language, is called as the Pundis, which is nothing but a heterogeneous mass of vegetation. So imagine that in the lake there is floating mass of organic matter, vegetation, soil, all put together. That itself becomes an island. Okay, and that island, the largest of that island, is 40 square kilometers, which is called as the Keibul Lamjung National Park, and it is an endemic species is found. What is the songhai? Is it a bird, amphibian, reptile, mammal? What is it? Dancing deer. Okay, I didn't know the dancing part. Okay, yeah, so I knew it as a deer, which is endangered and endemic, endangered and endemic. Okay, now in case of Keoladev National Park, the stress was caused due to the drought. In this case, the stress is directly caused due to anthropogenic or human reasons. First is there are 1 lakh people around the lake, and 1 lakh people depend on it for irrigation and fisheries. Irrigation and fisheries. So it becomes a source of livelihood for those people. Okay, it becomes a source of livelihood for the people. And on top of it, the government had also built a barrage to regulate the flow of water. It had also built a barrage. It was called as, forgetting the name, Ikai or something. Second, I may have, I think I've missed that part. I'll get back to you on the name of the barrage. But there is a barrage which further makes, because you can't have a barrage in a national park and expect that there can be no impact on the biodiversity of that region. Okay. Oh yeah, I mentioned it here. It's called as the Ikai barrage. So all these are contributed. The barrage, irrigation, the fisheries, all of them have contributed to it. Key obligations and pillars of conventions, very theoretical. I'm not taking more points on this. The rest of the topic will talk tomorrow. It's already 10 minutes past 8:30. So, sorry, not tomorrow, but, on Friday. So, Friday we'll be able to complete biodiversity as a topic. We are almost towards the end. There are a couple of more current affairs. So, we will be completing biodiversity towards the